Right, the bellows struts just need to be cleaned generally. So again, cotton bud, solvent, wipe all the surfaces, remove any old grease, associated dirt, dust and grit. Try and get this as clean as you can. There's a reason this doesn't go into the ultrasonic cleaner. The most pressing one probably is these buttons, the release buttons for top and bottom of the struts there. They've got a little daub of paint in the middle of them, and that little blob of paint will disappear if it goes into the ultrasonic cleaner. We don't need it to be surgically clean, just an awful lot better than it currently is. So the old grease will be trapping dust, grit, etc. that have gathered up in here over the past 6 or 7 decades. So we want all that gone. Sometimes these struts will be fairly clean and won't take you long to whiz around them. Other times they'll be rusty and crusty and a bit of a mess. Right, that looks good. So now I'm looking at the state of the struts to see if anything needs to be straightened out. Now the inner struts, they should be in a straight line. The end should be at 90 degrees. That's off. That one's not so bad. I'll give that a little bit of a tweak too. The outer struts have a bit of a bow in them. That's intentional. It provides spring tension to make sure that these pins pop up into place. Though having said that, that shouldn't be overdone, so I'm just checking to see what that looks like. And you can probably see that the struts are wider at this end than they are at the frame here. And when it's trapped in the body, these sides will be parallel, which means that the arms will be under tension and the spring buttons have got quite a bit of spring to them. So those struts look good, they're clean, they're ready to go back in. Here we have the focus scale ring, and the focus scale ring will need to be cleaned. It'll have traces of old grease on the back surface in particular. You can see it coming off on the cotton bud there. Q-tip for some of you. So I'm just wiping that out just to get all the dust and old grease and any other rubbish out of it. Sometimes you'll find with cameras where the focus has been very stiff because the grease has dried out and people have forced the focus once or twice and it might have been the odd repair putting things back. You'll notice that there are bumps on the back here where the screw heads have come through, where they've been pulled up, and basically it pulls up a bit of the metal. And of course that makes for a rough surface that doesn't want to always move smoothly around the mount, in that which case you would take your screwdriver and just rub that bump back down flush. Try and put things back where they started from. So that ring's good. This. Here we have the body of the focus mechanism and focus assembly. And the grease here is very often very hard. Sometimes it's quite dry. Sometimes it's dried out like some really cheap wax candles get, where they're it fractures more than anything else if you drop them. So I want all of that out. It makes the focus, it can make the focus very stiff. Particularly if it's got a dry feel about it. This camera was not bad. As I said, the focus was stiffer than it should be, but it was comparatively smooth. This grease, like all grease, tends to gather up, passing dust and grit over time and trap it. So it's useful to get rid of it, so you can get rid of those abrasive nuisances at the same time. And set it up with some nice fresh lubricant, which should, in theory, see it go on for another half a century or so. Now who can say what will be happening by then? Right, got rid of the bulk of it there, so now with some cotton bud, a bit of lighter fluid on the end of the cotton bud, wipe all those surfaces and so until they're nice shiny metal again, with no hint of that brown tinge from the grease. You can see you pick up quite a bit of mess there. And as you might have guessed, you go through a fair few of these cotton buds doing this job, but it's worth it. Anyway, they're cheap enough. They're coming a couple of $100 in each little tub, and they're only a few dollars at a time, so that's good. So that component's clean, and that can be ready to be reassembled into the camera. Yuck. We'll just hide that mess inside there. We'll turn that to the inside. This is the coupling for the rangefinder. Again, I'm just moving old grease off there. There's only one moving part here, and it's that hinge joint at this point, and that doesn't require any attention. Unless it was unusually stiff, which would be extremely uncommon. If there'd been some corrosion or something, perhaps that would be the case, and then a little spot of oil or something right on that pivot would be helpful, but generally speaking you need to do nothing with that. So that's all clean. What else have we got? Oh, the take-up spool. Now, cigarette lighter fluid, which is Naphtha, is a fairly benign petroleum solvent. It's usually pretty good on plastics like this. Unlike this stuff, which is aggressive and elite plastic, just looking at it from the other side of the room. This stuff is usually safe, particularly on this particular plastic. So I'm just wiping it to make sure I've got rid of any traces of old grease and oil. Having a look at the spool itself to see if it's got any problems. It looks quite clean. The rest of it would just polish with a cloth. That's good. The sprocket shaft, I'd already had a look at that. That seemed fine. On some old cameras that have been very heavily used, the sprockets here can actually be worn down to the extent where you may get some slippage on the film, but that's very unusual, and you wouldn't normally be looking for that to happen. That's quite good so far. film advance lever. Usual thing, I'm wiping away any old grease along with any dust and dirt and grit that it might have accumulated. Don't go mad trying to shine the underside of that lever. I'm sure it was never shiny. That's good. We don't want any stiffness in the frame counter mechanism caused by dried out grease or grit or anything of that nature, because any extra stiffness in the mechanism means that the pawl or spring, frame counter spring, will have to work harder to shift the counter dial around to the next position. And if it has to work harder, it means that it has to flex more. And if it has to flex more, inevitably it means it will fail all that much sooner. So it's worth making sure that all the frame counter components are clean. You see some dots on that piece perhaps. They are probably just corrosion spots, or in fact in this case I think they may even be overspray paint from when they sprayed the base layer of the paint on that. I'll do the rewind knob while I'm here. Usually there's not much to do with rewind knobs. Make sure that the film reminder dial can be turned. That's usually quite stiff. You wouldn't want it being knocked too easily anyway. If that rotates smoothly, then there's no more to do with that. That's good. And our surround for the tripod socket. It's aluminium. It was probably polished and lacquered originally. Very often the lacquer is gone. It's either worn away, been abraded on the case, things of that nature. And if it's been put somewhere damp, you end up with corrosion on it. You could spend an awful lot of time trying to make that look shiny again. Basically, you'd want to use a solvent on it, strip away any last remaining lacquer, and then it would need to be mechanically polished, and then it would need to be re-lacquered. Now that's a bit of a task, and to be honest, this lives on the bottom of the camera, and if the camera's in a case, it is never ever going to be seen except when you're loading the film. So it's hard to get too enthusiastic about trying to make that look perfect. You can certainly see corrosion on this one, and it's just surface corrosion. That's quite normal. So to this top cover, and I'll need to be cleaning this up ready for reassembly too. So I'll start here by removing these two screws which hold this bracket in place and which holds the front glass for the two windows at the front of the top housing there. One that provides the viewfinder image and one that provides the rangefinder image. There's our bracket, our two pieces of glass. They are fairly clean. Certainly nothing too offensive there. And here we have the three screws holding that tripod socket in place. So we'll remove the two originals. That's tight. That's tight. That doesn't surprise me greatly. They would have been tightened up, or the opportunity would have been there to tighten those up when whoever repaired their camera to fix that problem with the missing screw and the damaged shoe that they didn't bother to fix. Put them there. Right, so we'll loosen this screw up and I'll have a look at that. Well, it's certainly a foreigner, and it was too long for the job. And I'm looking closely at the top of the camera now to see if there's any distortion of that top plate. it looks pretty good. So it means that any damage there was mostly taken by the accessory shoe itself, not the top cover. Here I'm just using a bit of solvent on a cotton bud to wipe away that, clear all that dirt off. Now that top cover looks good. There's a little patch of corrosion just there. That's not at all uncommon. Again, you have dissimilar metals. You have the aluminium body of the camera, and this top cover is chrome plated brass. And so with dissimilar metals, you've always got the likelihood of some electrolytic corrosion process setting up. You only need to provide it with an electrolyte, which is typically moisture, and a bit of salt to help it make it go, sweat, stuff like that, skin oils. That top cover looks good. That shoe needs to be dealt with. So I'll put these components aside. They need to be cleaned before they go back. I need to find another screw to replace that screw, and I'm looking at this unfortunate looking shoe here, and it'll need some panel bedding. So I can see here, see if I can get that so it catches the light. Here. It's quite high at this point. That tells me that that shoe was pulled backwards quite strongly, probably because there was a flash on there and the camera was dropped and the flash hit the floor first. And that screw, it may even have damage, it may even damage the threads in here in the shoe. So they may not be as tight as they once were. Anyway, I'm going to take that away and give it a little bit of a tappy tap tap, and hopefully it'll come back looking like I bought one. Right, well, I have done some panel beating on this shoe. It's now a more appropriate shape, and we'll try fitting it back to the camera top. I found another screw too, which is just as well. I'll just nip those screws up, being careful not to over tighten that one. I'm going to lock those screws with a little touch of lacquer. This is just cheap nail varnish, stuff you buy at the discount store, not the stuff your wife wears. I don't like it if you use their stuff. So I'm just going to put a dob around each of those screws. It doesn't need to be too pretty, it just needs to do the job. One of the advantages of using something like that, something that's clearly there, is that anybody who comes along to repair the camera at a later date can immediately tell it's been locked in place with lacquer, and they would just give it a little touch of acetone or something similar in order to melt that before they went to undo the screws. If you used clear nail varnish in that position, it might not be immediately obvious what had happened, and you could damage the top of a screw trying to get the thing out if you weren't aware that there was lacquer there already. So that's the shoe sorted out, and that looks much better. You'll notice that there's a line in the middle of the shoe at that point, and that quite simply is because somebody has slid an electronic flash into that shoe, and the electronic flash had a hot shoe contact in the middle of the shoe, and this satin chrome marks very, very easily. So what's happened is someone slid one of those in there, it has marked that chrome. There's no danger of ever getting those marks out. It's just a bright line now. That's just the way of it. The only way you can avoid doing that, of course, is to avoid sliding a flash into the shoe that has a centre contact that would mark that shoe. So I'm just wiping the inside of the case now with some, again, lighter fluid on a cotton bud, just to take away any dirt and dust and old grease and so forth. And then that will be, I'll clean up the glass that's in there and put that back, and then that can all just sit to one side until we're ready to put the top back on the camera. So I'm going to clean up the viewfinder components here, get them back into the top cover. These are just the cover glasses, they're not lenses. So I've just got a little bit of glass cleaner on the end of a cotton bud. First I'll do the little eyepiece glass. I'll do the outside surface first because it makes it easier to judge when you've done a proper job on the inside surface. As you can see, I'm just swirling that tip backwards and forwards, and there it mushrooms out and cleans a quite wide piece of that glass. Much more than you'd expect through that small rectangular opening. So I've blown out any dust, and I'm just checking it to see if it is in fact clean, and that looks good. So start with a fresh cotton bud, a drop of glass cleaner, and that's just domestic glass cleaner. It's nothing fancy, it's not deionised water from Mars or anything weird. Just make sure I clean all those glass surfaces. The outside glass surfaces will have picked up the usual atmospheric contaminants, finger grease and everything else. The inside surfaces, they'll have picked up a bit of dust and dirt, and probably some degree of oil vapour will have settled on there. Oils that have volatile components of them will have settled on the glass that have come from somewhere else inside the camera. So I'm just checking those now. I have a look to make sure that I think they are adequately cleaned. Just a little fleck of something on there. I don't know whether it's a bit of dust or a scratch. Once these are back on the camera, it's hard to get right to the corners of them because the glass is tucked in, so that one's not quite so clean. I'll give that a little bit more treatment, I think. Sometimes the deposits of muck on the glass is quite hard to get to shift. It's okay. That frame, I will just wipe that with a bit of solvent. on a cotton bud, just to remove any dust, and in this case any grease that might, oils of that might have settled on it. I don't expect to find much, and the cotton bud comes off fairly clean. Now these two pieces of glass have one beveled edge on the long surface. That goes against the top of the camera body. If you put them on the other way up, they will not fit quite so neatly. I'll just slide that into the body and pop the two screws back in place. Making a final check to see if those pieces of glass are settled in, or that the frame is, that they're settled into their socket in the frame. And one of them looks a little bit off. I'm just going to slacken those screws and see if it'll shift. That's better. That glass is looking good. I'll give that one last clean. It's much easier to deal with the glass once it's been firmly held in place in a frame than it is when you're trying to deal with it floating free on a piece of paper. But by taking the glass out, it gives you a chance to get right into the corners and the edges, which you just cannot achieve that unless you take the glass out. Right, so there's our top cover, all cleaned up, ready to go back on the camera. I think we can start with our camera again here. And I have my componentry back from the cleaner. And so we can start reassembling it. Let's get the first pieces that we need. Where's our transfer shaft? That shaft. That spacer. And there should be one bracket here that I'm looking for. These are components I need to get in before we put the bellows in, these struts back in rather. Well, I'm not seeing what I'm looking for. Excuse me. is under something inside. Oh, I saw a glimpse of it there. There it is. It's hiding inside something else. And to put that lot back in the body, we need the screws. And the screws that we need will be the 4 black ones. And 1 spring. That spring is the return spring, and it's the return spring for the shutter release mechanism here. Just checking where, make sure I knew where that spacer was when I come to use that. Right, next we want some lubricant.